Philadelphia, the second half of the 1980s. A lurking shadow roams in the darkness of the city's Frankfurt neighborhood. This mysterious assailant, who haunts the deserted streets at midnight, will target their most vulnerable victims, leaving a chilling trail behind. This serial killer, later dubbed the Frankford Slasher by the press, would terrorize Philadelphia from 1985 to 1990, brutally ending the lives of 9 women. However, no one ever definitively learned the killer's identity. On a sweltering August morning in the summer of 1985, a horrifying discovery was made near a train line in Philadelphia's Frankfurt neighborhood. The lifeless body of 52-year-old Helen Patton was found naked from the waist down, her breasts exposed, and brutally stabbed 19 times. A deep cut across her abdomen was violent enough to expose her internal organs. This sight indicated a type of savagery no one in Frankfurt was accustomed to. Neighbors and relatives believed Helen would never willingly go to a secluded place with a stranger, suggesting she likely knew the killer. Her ex-husband, who had lived in the same house for years but led separate lives, immediately identified Helen's body and informed the police that she had left home a week before her murder without saying where she was going. While this first murder sparked fear and curiosity in the neighborhood, no one yet knew it was just the beginning of a nightmare. Months later, on January 3, 1986, a second victim was found. This time, 68-year-old Anna Carroll was found dead in her bedroom in South Philadelphia. The apartment door was wide open on a cold winter day. Anna was laid out on the floor, naked from the waist down. She had sustained 6 stab wounds to her back. However, there was a gruesome wound extending from her breastbone to her groin. Additionally, a kitchen knife had been left plunged into her chest. Although there was distance between the two murders, the similarities in timing and methods unsettled the police. Both occurred at night. The victims were partially naked and their bodies were mutilated. The fear that began in the Frankfurt neighborhood was showing signs of spreading to other parts of the city. On Christmas Day in 1986, Philadelphia police encountered a third horrifying scene when neighbors noticed the door to Susan Olseff's home was open. 64-year-old Susan was found inside her house, again stabbed to death 6 times in the back. All 3 victims shared a commonality. They were regulars at a bar called the Golden Bar on Frankfurt Avenue. The Golden Bar, officially known as the Golden Bar, and the surrounding pubs were the heart of Frankfurt's nightlife at that time. Most of these women, many living alone and some struggling with alcohol and substance issues, spent their nights in these establishments. It began to be suspected that the killer was choosing his victims from these very bars. These consecutive murders ceased to be mere coincidences for the police, clearly pointing to the presence of a serial killer. Right at the beginning of 1987, the serial killer's reign of terror continued to escalate. On the morning of January 8, 1987, the body of 28-year-old homeless Jean Durkin was found in an empty lot near Frankfurt Avenue. Jean was a well-known figure in the area, often sleeping in the entrance of an abandoned bakery just 2 buildings away from Frankfurt's Golden Bar. The sight was chilling when her blood-soaked body was found lying under the bed of a truck. She had sustained a staggering 74 stab wounds to her body. She was naked from the waist down, and her legs were spread apart. Blood had splattered everywhere, even spraying onto a fence and the side of the truck. An autopsy confirmed Jean had been sexually assaulted. This was now the 4th victim, and the method was the same. Furthermore, Jean's discovery point was only a block away from where the first victim, Helen Patton, was murdered. The Philadelphia press finally began openly reporting that these murders were connected. A serial killer was on the loose in the city. As fear gripped the narrow streets of the Frankfurt neighborhood, pressure on the police steadily mounted. The outrage in the community grew with the increasing number of victims. In mid-January 1987, a group of about 50 Frankfurt residents gathered with candles under the Frankfurt train station to commemorate the victims and defy the killer. They prayed through tears, paid their respects to the murdered women, and sent a message of unity against the killer. This collective response showed that the neighborhood residents were both living in fear and beginning to unite within themselves. However, the Frankfurt Slasher was preparing to fall silent for a while. Aiming to make the police drop their guard, there were no murder reports for about a year, until November 1988. 66-year-old Margaret Vaughn was found dead on November 11, 1988, in the entrance of an apartment building on Penn Street in Frankfurt. Interestingly, Margaret had been evicted from her apartment in that building the same day for failing to pay rent. It was believed she had sought refuge in familiar bars to spend the night. Her lifeless body was discovered in the lobby of her former apartment building the following morning. Margaret had been stabbed a brutal 29 times. Witnesses reported seeing her drinking at a bar the night before the incident with a middle-aged, round-faced white man with a limping gait and glasses. Based on this description, the police drew a composite sketch and distributed it around Frankfurt. Finally, there seemed to be a concrete lead. However, despite the distributed sketch, the mysterious man could not be identified. The Frankfurt Slasher had struck again. Just 2 months later, on January 19, 1989, 30-year-old Teresa Sciortino was found dead in her home on Errol Street in Frankfurt. Teresa was a young woman living alone who had spent time in the hospital due to psychological problems. Her body was found lying on her back in the middle of the kitchen floor, with only white socks on her feet. She had sustained 25 stab wounds to her body. This time, the brutal killer had also used a 3-foot-long wooden stick for sexual assault. The stick, with bloodstains on it, was left propped against the kitchen counter. The killer also left behind a bloody footprint. Neighbors told police that the night before, they had heard sounds of a struggle and a thud, similar to a heavy object falling, coming from Teresa's house. Crime scene investigation showed a violent struggle had taken place throughout the house, spreading from room to room. Blood had splattered everywhere, from the walls to the floors. The location where Teresa was murdered was only 3 blocks from where the previous victim, Margaret, was found, and 1.5 blocks from Frankfurt Avenue. Furthermore, like the other victims, Teresa was a regular at the bars in the Frankfurt area. She had last been seen at the Jolly Post Tavern 1.5 days before her death, where she was reportedly spending time with a middle-aged white man. According to neighbors, Teresa frequently brought male friends home. Indeed, some had seen her take a man home shortly before her death. There was no change in the Frankfurt Slasher's victim profile. All were white women. Their ages ranged from 28 to 68, but they all shared the same social circle, spent time in the same bars, and all had died from savage stab wounds. The killer acted with extreme caution, leaving almost no physical evidence or witnesses behind. After the murder of Teresa Sciortino, Philadelphia police were forced to confront the reality that a serial killer was rampant in Frankfurt. Although they had initially resisted the idea of a serial killer, with the 6th victim, it became clear that these incidents could not be coincidental. Police had interrogated hundreds of people in Frankfurt, from bar employees to neighborhood residents, and collected countless statements. Yet, despite this massive investigative effort, the killer's identity remained unknown. Nevertheless, detectives now began to re-examine a past unsolved case. A 29-year-old woman named Catherine M. Jones was found dead on a sidewalk under the snow in Philadelphia's Northern Liberties area in January 1987. A few weeks after the 4th victim, Sciortino. Catherine's murder was initially considered a separate case, as the cause of death was blunt force trauma to her head. However, it was learned that Catherine was also a waitress who frequented bars in the Frankfurt area. Due to potential suspects in her past, it was debatable whether this murder should be included in the Frankfurt Slasher series. Some police officers believed it might be unrelated. Still, it was impossible to reach a definitive conclusion. Therefore, the Catherine Jones case was also included in the file. Although not always officially listed, she was referred to as one of the Frankfurt Slasher's probable victims. During the years of the Frankfurt Slasher's terror, what kind of place was the Frankfurt neighborhood where these murders took place? Frankfurt, a neighborhood in northeast Philadelphia, was actually one of America's oldest settlements. Its founding even predated that of the city of Philadelphia itself. In the early 20th century, with the Industrial Revolution, the area developed, and the elevated train line, opened in 1922, brought vitality and commercial activity to the surroundings. However, by the 1980s, Frankfurt had lost its former glory, becoming impoverished and neglected due to economic decline and emigration. In those years, Frankfurt had transformed into a rundown neighborhood rampant with crime. It was a place where sex workers and drug addicts were commonplace on its streets, and the few small businesses struggled to survive. It was no coincidence that Sylvester Stallone chose Frankfurt's dilapidated backstreets for some scenes in his famous Rocky film. Frankfurt Avenue, once known as the King's Highway, stretched for 13 blocks, lined with all kinds of shops. But it was like a gloomy corridor overshadowed by the noisy, elevated train rumbling overhead. In this dark atmosphere, nightlife was paradoxically vibrant. Bars and nightclubs on Frankfurt Avenue stayed open until dawn. People would drink in these establishments before dispersing to their homes after getting off the train. Yet, this very activity inadvertently created perfect conditions for a serial killer to hide and strike. It was easy to remain anonymous in the crowds. Selecting intoxicated victims was effortless. In some of the murder locations, the lack of forced entry on doors suggested that the victims likely mistook the killer for someone they knew or voluntarily allowed them into their homes. This strengthened the theory that the killer met and gained trust with their victims in bars before launching their attacks. On the other hand, the Frankford Slasher wasn't Philadelphia's only nightmare. During the same period, multiple dangerous serial criminals emerged consecutively in the city. For example, in March 1987, police found women held captive and chained in the basement of a man named Gary Heidnik. It was revealed that Heidnik had tortured his victims, killed some, and even engaged in cannibalism. Also, in the summer of 1987, the decaying bodies of 6 women were removed from the home of another killer named Harrison Graham. Philadelphia, contrary to its nickname, the City of Brotherly Love, was experiencing a succession of horrific events in these years. The Frankford Slasher would remain an unsolved link in this terrifying chain of events. As police pursued the Frankford Slasher, they initially acted reluctantly and cautiously. After the first murders, despite media pressure, the Philadelphia Police Department was unwilling to publicly confirm that the murders were linked. In fact, police officials made a false statement, claiming there was no connection between these deaths and that there was no serial killer in the city. The aim of this statement was to prevent public panic, but if the killer was indeed active, it was a dangerous move that could wound his ego. Indeed, it was precisely during this period, after the police declared there was no serial killer, that the Frankfurt Slasher murders paused for approximately a year. Perhaps he was enraged that the notoriety attributed to him was being taken away. Or perhaps he chose to wait to cover his tracks. However, when the murders returned in late 1988, the press was no longer shy about vocalizing the truth. After the victims were found consecutively in 1988 to 1989, Philadelphia newspapers and television stations began to adorn their headlines with titles like "Frankfurt Fiend Among Us." The wave of fear from the serial murders had made it impossible for women, especially those living in Frankfurt and its vicinity, to go out. Many women made sure not to go out alone in the evenings or visit bars, as almost all the victims had been seen returning home from a bar late at night or with a stranger. The fact that all victims were women also triggered a societal concern. Women were being targeted. Perhaps vulnerable women living marginalized lives were specifically chosen. Among the Frankfurt Slasher's victims were homeless individuals, those with mental health issues, and those with alcohol problems. Newspapers detailed the victims' life stories, reflecting the cries of their neighbors and families. The difficulties of being a woman in these dark streets of the city were being discussed. The police, however, had very little concrete evidence. The composite sketch obtained after Margaret Vaughan's murder in 1988 became the first real lead. A model of a middle-aged, slightly heavy-set white man was drawn. This profile was based on the statement of the only surviving witness to the events. The bartender, who recounted what he saw at the bar the night Margaret died, described the man next to her in this way. In 1989, with the murder of Teresa Sciortino, Another witness gave a similar description. Theresa's neighbor, who saw her last, said she was with a middle-aged white man. However, this person was never found. Every distributed sketch, every appeal, went unanswered. The killer moved like a shadow, disappearing without a trace. During this period, as the investigation reached a dead end, the police were about to find the body of the last victim, Carol Dowd, and the discovery would change the entire process. In the early morning hours of April 29, 1990, around 1:50 a.m., a patrol officer passing through a dark alley behind a fish shop on Frankfurt Avenue came across a motionless body on the ground. 46-year-old Carol Dowd had just been murdered, naked and covered in blood, in this deserted alley. Carol's head and face were brutally crushed, and her body had sustained 36 stab wounds. Her face, neck, chest, and back were particularly targeted with stab wounds. Her abdominal area had been longitudinally cut open. Some of her organs had been removed. The killer seemed to be disemboweling and displaying their victim. Defensive wounds were found on Carol's hands, indicating she had tried to fight off her assailant. This murder was recorded as one of the Frankford Slasher's most brutal attacks. At the crime scene, Carol's clothes were found nearby. The contents of her open purse were scattered around. However, strikingly, none of her valuables had been stolen. Money was still in her wallet. Therefore, the possibility of robbery as a motive was eliminated. Carol Dowd had experienced mental health problems, but had recently been trying to lead a peaceful life in a supported living center within the community. However, she had a past trauma. She had been sexually assaulted in her own apartment years ago. So, like the previous victims, Carol was a fragile woman bearing the marks of a difficult life. As soon as the news of Carol's death broke, police had no doubt that this murder was also the work of the Frankford Slasher. The method now seemed familiar. Detectives believed the killer followed his victims after they left bars at night or apprehended them before they reached their destinations. Indeed, a few hours before Carol Dowd was murdered, she had been seen at a local bar with an older white man. There was an eyewitness who reported this to the police. This information was immediately consistent with previous descriptions of the suspect. Police began to question the employees of the fish shop, the scene of the crime, because the body was found in the alley directly behind the shop. Leonard Christopher, a 38-year-old fishmonger, initially thought it was a robbery when he saw the police behind the shop that night. He even stated that he thought, either they robbed the store again, or maybe they're catching someone for drugs, as that alley was frequently a site for sex work and drug sales at night. However, once he learned the police were investigating a murder, Leonard began to speak with them, confessing that he knew the murdered woman and had even personally known Margaret Vaughn, another victim from the area. Leonard Christopher was a resident of Frankfurt who worked at the fish market, was well liked in the community, and outwardly lived a modest life. Yet, as the investigation into Carol Dowd's murder progressed, he would become the prime suspect. When police asked him where he had spent the night, Leonard said he was with his girlfriend. However, his girlfriend, Vivian Carter, told police she had spent that night alone at home, and Leonard was not with her. This inconsistency led detectives to focus more intently on Leonard. As the investigation deepened, other witnesses began to say they had seen Leonard with Carol Dowd that night. A bar patron confirmed that Leonard and Carol were chatting at a bar around midnight. A female sex worker eventually admitted to seeing the two leave the bar together. Another witness claimed to have seen Leonard emerging from the alley next to the fish shop on the night of the murder, covered in blood and sweat, with a large knife attached to his belt. Following these claims, police searched Leonard Christopher's home. It was announced that blood-stained clothes belonging to Leonard were found in the house. Leonard attempted to provide his own explanation for this, allegedly stating that his employer had sent him to clean up bloodstains remaining in the alley after a robbery at the shop, and that fish blood might have gotten on his clothes for this reason. Indeed, during the police investigation, a co-worker, whose name was kept confidential, defended him to the press, saying, "Our boss told Leonard to clean the blood in the street, so it's normal for blood to have splashed on him." Other colleagues who knew Leonard also gave positive references, describing him as good-natured and helpful, and stated they could not believe he was being accused of these murders. Even Leonard's landlord told police that his tenant's only fault was making noise occasionally, but that he was generally a trouble-free person. Despite all this positive testimony, Leonard Christopher was now the prime suspect in the eyes of the police. On May 5, 1990, Leonard was arrested and brought to court. He was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated assault of a corpse, and possession of an instrument of crime. Additionally, due to Carol's belongings being scattered around, attempted robbery was also among the accusations. What was interesting was that Leonard's physical characteristics did not match the suspect description given by witnesses who saw him with earlier victims. Leonard was a black man, whereas witnesses had consistently spoken of a white, middle-aged man. Nevertheless, given the circumstances and the suspicions surrounding Carol Dowd's murder, the police tended to overlook this contradiction. Leonard was sent to prison without bail and began to await his trial in custody. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief with Leonard's arrest. After months of uncertainty and fear, the capture of someone finally allowed people to take a deep breath. Newspapers announced Leonard's arrest with headlines like, "Frankfurt Monster Caught." Many Frankfurt residents hoped that even if the wrong person was caught, they would at least no longer feel as much fear when going out and could return to normal life. However, this sense of relief would not last long. The terror of the Frankford Slasher would deliver one final blow, even while Leonard Christopher was behind bars. 4 months after Leonard Christopher's arrest, one more victim was added to the Frankford Slasher file. On September 6, 1990, 30-year-old Michelle Daner was found dead in her apartment on the 4th floor of a building in Frankfurt. Michelle Daner's name had actually come up before in the Frankford Slasher investigation. This woman had lived in the same area as Jean Durkin in 1987, and had even been briefly placed on the suspect list due to being involved in a blanket dispute with Durkin. But now Michelle was also a victim of a murder committed while Leonard Christopher was awaiting trial in prison before being convicted. Michelle's body was found lying on the floor in her home. She had sustained a total of 23 stab wounds to her body. The blows to her chest and abdomen in particular were as brutal as those on the other victims. There were no signs of forced entry at her home. Just like in previous indoor attacks, the killer had been able to enter without using force. Michelle likely knew him or had willingly let him in. The knife or any other instrument used in the murder was not found in the house or the surrounding area. The location where Michelle Daner's murder occurred was just blocks away from the street where Carol Dowd was killed. It was also on the same road as Erat Street, where Teresa Sciortino was murdered in 1989. Michelle was known in the neighborhood for her strange behavior. Residents had nicknamed her Crazy Michelle. She would sometimes barricade her apartment door from the inside, and other times she would surprise those around her by throwing random objects out her window. A single woman with a tough demeanor, Michelle spent most of her days frequenting Frankfurt's bars and drinking. She was known to sometimes sell pretzels on the street to make a living, but most of the time she just tried to find money for drinks. A day and a half before her death, some people saw Michelle leaving a bar with a middle-aged white man. In fact, there were witnesses who said she often brought different men home. The Michelle Daner murder sent the police department into a dilemma. Leonard Christopher was still arrested, awaiting trial, and this murder had been committed while he was in prison. This fact raised the question, was Leonard not the real killer? However, the Philadelphia Police Department's official statement characterized Michelle's murder as a copycat killing, trying to separate it from the Frankford Slasher series. According to detectives, perhaps someone else in the area had killed the last victim by mimicking the Frankford Slasher's methods. This way, they could categorize the murder separately without needing to exonerate Leonard Christopher. However, many people were not convinced by this explanation, as the manner of Michelle's killing, the proximity of the location, and the victim's profile bore the exact signature of the Frankfurt Slasher. The copycat killer explanation was perceived as an attempt by the police to cover up the possibility that they had caught the wrong person. Leonard Christopher appeared before a judge in Philadelphia in December 1990. He was charged only with the murder of Carol Dowd. No accusations were made concerning the other victims, as no concrete link could be established between him and those murders. The prosecution presented various pieces of evidence against Leonard in the Carol Dowd murder case. Foremost among these was a strange statement Leonard made to his boss shortly before his arrest. In his testimony in court, Jis Feng, the owner of News Seafood, recounted that a few days after the murder, Leonard came to him and said, "A white woman around 45 was killed on the street last night." However, it was emphasized that the police at that stage had not released information to the press about Carol's identity or details. So according to the prosecutor, Leonard had conveyed details to his boss that only the killer could have known. Furthermore, his boss, Feng, stated that Leonard had made a rather bizarre confession to him. Leonard had at one point casually said, "Maybe I killed her," and then immediately retracted his words. As he said this, he had made hand gestures as if disemboweling a person, performing gestures that mimicked the murder. These strange behaviors, according to Feng's testimony, suggested that Leonard showed an obsessive curiosity about the murder and could seriously be guilty. The prosecution also stated that Leonard had claimed to have seen the murder before the police arrived, mentioning a white man, but it was later understood that he was not actually there that night. In his statement to the police, Leonard had claimed that he was at his girlfriend's house that night, but when he looked out the window, he saw a well-dressed white man in his 40s walking down the street wiping his hand with a handkerchief. This description actually matched the description given by witnesses related to earlier victims. However, his girlfriend, Vivian Carter, had proven that Leonard was not with her that night. Therefore, Leonard's story of seeing this white man turned out to be false. A very small bloodstain found on Leonard's pants was presented in court as physical evidence. However, the stain was so minute that blood typing or DNA profiling could not be performed. In 1990, DNA analysis was just beginning to be used in courts and had not yet gained reliability, especially for such tiny samples. Apart from this, a bloody handkerchief found on a side road near Leonard's house was brought in as evidence. The blood on the handkerchief was determined to be type O, which was Carol Dowd's blood type. However, the defense attorneys argued that even this handkerchief did not definitively point to Leonard. This was because Leonard had stated in his police statement that he saw a white man in his 40s outside, and that man was wiping his hand with a handkerchief. Therefore, they put forward the possibility that the handkerchief found on the ground could actually belong to the real killer. However, since it was proven that Leonard was not there that night, this scenario did not gain credibility in the eyes of the jury. The defense attorney for Leonard Christopher began his defense by emphasizing that Leonard was a respectable and non-violent person, stating that there was no direct evidence whatsoever, and that the case was based entirely on circumstantial evidence and unreliable witness statements. The attorney stated that not the slightest trace of violence had been found in his client's past, and that such a brutal crime was inconsistent with his character. Furthermore, he claimed that there was no apparent motive, that the murder weapon could not be found, and that the resolution of the case was nothing more than a weak fabrication based on police theories. The defense argued that Leonard's story to the police about a white man on the night of the murder actually matched the description of the suspect seen with previous victims, making the scenario attributed to Leonard illogical. The prosecutor reminded the court that some of the witnesses were Leonard's friends, and one of them had initially lied to protect him, but later confessed the truth due to a guilty conscience. On December 12, 1990, the jury reached a verdict. Leonard Christopher was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Carol Dowd. Leonard stood motionless in the courtroom, showing no reaction to the verdict. His defense attorney shook his head, indicating his disbelief in the decision. The prosecutor had requested the death penalty, but the judge sentenced Leonard to life in prison. As Leonard Christopher was escorted to prison, he reportedly screamed that he was innocent and blamed the women who testified against him. His attorney, meanwhile, asserted that the real killer had not been apprehended and was still at large, responsible for the murder of Michelle Daner. Was this truly the case? With Leonard Christopher's conviction, the Frankfurt Slasher case officially seemed closed. However, it left behind countless doubts and unanswered questions. Michael Newton, a renowned author in crime literature, still lists the Frankfurt Slasher case as an unsolved series of murders in his works. Despite knowing that Leonard Christopher was convicted of one murder, he draws attention to the question marks surrounding this conviction. He particularly emphasizes that there was no evidence linking Leonard to the other 8 murders. Indeed, official authorities held Leonard responsible only for the Carol Dowd murder and did not open files on the other victims. While the Philadelphia police stated they continued to view Leonard as the probable perpetrator of the other murders, they also admitted that there might be other suspects. Years have passed, but the legend of the Frankfurt Slasher continues to be whispered, sending shivers down spines with each retelling. It remains unknown whether the true killer is still free or has gone to their grave. This uncertainty is enough to make you, the viewer, ask yourself a question in the dead of night. What if the killer was never caught? This very thought continues to keep the shadow of the Frankfurt Slasher alive.